My name is Sophie Brown. I'm in my early 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described the same way: capable, composed, dependable. I work in a role that looks stable from the outside. I speak calmly. I don't overshare. I don't raise my voice. People often assume that means I've always had things under control. What they don't usually see is how early I learned to stay quiet. Growing up, I was the kind of child adults liked. I got good grades. I followed the rules. I didn't cause trouble. Teachers praised my discipline. Relatives admired my report cards. And my parents, especially my parents, measured my worth almost entirely through numbers written in red ink at the top of a page. From the outside, my childhood looked successful. From the inside, it felt narrow, conditional, fragile. This isn't a story about abusive parents in the obvious sense. There were no shouted insults, no dramatic ultimatums. My parents believed they were doing the right thing. They believed pressure built character. They believed anxiety was just laziness in disguise. They believed that emotional discomfort was a small price to pay for academic excellence. And because they believed that, they didn't see me disappearing. In this video, I want to tell you what it's like when your achievements are celebrated, but your inner life is ignored. When your stress is reframed as motivation. When your exhaustion is treated as a failure of discipline rather than a signal of pain. This is a story about the cost of academic pressure, not just on grades or careers, but on identity, self-trust, and the ability to ask for help without feeling ashamed. I'm not sharing this for drama. There's no revenge here, no villain monologue, no sudden triumph. What happened unfolded quietly over the years through small decisions and long silences. It's about how being valued only for performance can teach you to disappear emotionally, and how, eventually, that disappearance forces a reckoning. You'll hear about moments that seemed insignificant at the time, conversations that ended too quickly, questions that were never asked. You'll also hear about the slow shift that happens when silence stops being passive and starts becoming intentional. This story doesn't end with me cutting anyone off or proving anyone wrong in a single scene. It ends with clarity, with boundaries, with a different understanding of what success actually costs and what it's worth. If you've ever felt like your mental health mattered less than your results, if you were praised for coping instead of being supported, if you learned early that love felt safest when you were achieving, I want you to listen, not to compare pain, but to recognize patterns. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and honestly. When was the first time you realized that doing well didn't necessarily mean being well? To my parents, I was the smart one, not the sensitive one, not the anxious one, not the tired one, just the smart one. The child whose value could be summarized in exam scores and teacher comments. When relatives asked about me, my parents didn't talk about my interests or how I felt about school. They talked about rankings, percentiles, future universities. I became a walking progress report long before I became a person in my own eyes. At home, conversations followed a predictable rhythm. How was school? Fine. What did you get on the test? That second question was the one that mattered. Everything else was background noise. If the grade was high, the conversation ended quickly, satisfied. If it was lower than expected, Even if it was still objectively good. There was a pause, a tightening in the air, a recalibration of tone, not anger exactly, disappointment disguised as concern. They would say things like, "We know you can do better," or "This isn't like you." Sometimes you need to focus more. What they never asked was why I was struggling. They didn't ask if I was sleeping. They didn't notice that I had started waking up with a tight chest, or that my stomach hurt most mornings before school. Those things didn't fit into their framework. There was no column for emotional strain, no grading rubric for fear. At school, teachers praised my discipline. I was quiet, attentive, and reliable. I turned in assignments early. I didn't disrupt class. That reputation followed me everywhere. Adults trusted me. Peers assumed I had it easy. And my parents took all of that as proof that their approach was working. Invisibility often looks like success when no one is trained to look deeper. I learned very quickly what earned approval and what didn't. Tears made my parents uncomfortable. Anxiety was treated like a distraction. If I said I felt overwhelmed, the response wasn't cruelty, it was efficiency. Everyone feels stressed. That's just part of life. You'll thank us later. So I stopped bringing those things up. I became efficient too. Efficient at swallowing discomfort. Efficient at presenting calm. Efficient at turning emotional distress into silence so it wouldn't interfere with performance. I wasn't trying to manipulate anyone. I was adapting. Children do that instinctively. They figure out what keeps them safe. And in my house, safety looked like achievement. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being praised while you're quietly unraveling. Because praise creates obligation. If everyone thinks you're doing well, you feel guilty admitting you're not. You start to believe that struggling means you're ungrateful, weak, dramatic. So I minimized myself. When panic started creeping in before exams, I told myself it was motivation. When I couldn't concentrate because my mind was racing, I worked longer hours instead of asking for help. When I felt numb, I assumed it was maturity. My parents loved me. I know that now. But their love was expressed through pressure, not presence. Through expectations, not curiosity. They believed preparing me for a competitive world meant hardening me against my own emotions. What they didn't understand was that emotions don't disappear when ignored. They go underground. They resurface later, often louder, often messier. To them, I was reliable, low maintenance, easy, the child they never had to worry about. And that, strangely enough, was the problem. Because when you're the child no one worries about, you don't get checked on. You don't get asked the second question. You don't get permission to falter. You become invisible, not because you're neglected outright, but because you perform stability so well that no one imagines you might need support. I didn't resent my parents back then. I internalized everything. I believed the story they were telling, that my feelings were secondary, that resilience meant silence, that success required sacrifice, and that sacrifice was supposed to hurt. I didn't know yet how expensive that belief would be. The first time I realized something was wrong, it didn't happen during a big argument or a dramatic breakdown. It happened on an ordinary weekday afternoon, the kind that disappears in memory unless something quietly sharp happens inside it. I was 14. I had just received the results of a mathematics exam. It was a subject I usually excelled in, the one my parents like to mention most often when talking about my potential. This time, though, I scored a few points lower than usual. Still above average, still objectively good, but not excellent. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding the paper in my hands, waiting for my mother to finish what she was doing so I could show her. I wasn't scared. Not yet. I was more unsure. I had been struggling with sleep that week. My mind wouldn't slow down at night. I felt foggy during the exam. I wanted to explain that part too. When she finally looked at the paper, her eyes went straight to the number. She didn't read the comments. She didn't ask how I felt. She just tilted her head slightly and said, "What happened here? Are you okay? Was the test difficult? Just what happened?" I started to answer. I told her I'd been feeling anxious lately, that I couldn't sleep, that my thoughts kept looping, even during the test. I didn't use big words. I didn't dramatize it. I was careful, already sensing that I needed to be. She sighed, not in frustration, more in inconvenience. "Sophie, everyone feels nervous sometimes," she said. "You can't let that affect your performance." Then she added, "You need to learn how to manage that. University won't be any easier." That was it. The conversation was over. She handed the paper back to me and went back to what she was doing. The moment passed. No raised voices, no punishment, no cruelty that anyone else would notice. But something inside me closed. That was the first small cut. The moment I understood that my internal experience was less relevant than my output. That explaining how I felt didn't lead to care, only to correction. That vulnerability, even when offered calmly, was treated as a flaw to be managed rather than a signal to be understood. I didn't cry. I nodded. I went to my room and sat at my desk, staring at the wall longer than I'd like to admit. I remember thinking, okay, so this is how it works. From that day on, I edited myself. I stopped mentioning the nights I lay awake counting my breaths. I stopped talking about the tight feeling in my chest before exams. When I felt overwhelmed, I framed it as being busy instead of being anxious. Busy was acceptable. Anxiety was not. At school, nothing changed. Teachers still praised me. Friends still assumed I was confident. At home, my parents seemed relieved. I was back on track, productive, focused, and because no one reacted to that moment, because there were no consequences, no visible damage, it would have been easy to dismiss it as insignificant. But small cuts don't bleed much. They don't demand attention. They heal on the surface while leaving sensitivity underneath. That interaction taught me something very specific. That emotional honesty created discomfort for the people I depended on. And once a child learns that, they adapt quickly. I learned to translate pain into productivity, fear into preparation, exhaustion into discipline. What no one noticed was that the cost of this translation was accumulating. I began measuring my worth more harshly than my parents ever did. I internalized their expectations and raised them. When I succeeded, I felt relief, not pride. When I struggled, I felt shame, not curiosity. My inner voice became an echo of theirs, efficient, demanding, emotionally unavailable. And the world rewarded that version of me, which made it even harder to question whether something was wrong. That first small cut didn't hurt because of what was said. It hurt because of what wasn't. It was the absence of a follow up question, the absence of interest in my inner world, the quiet message that feelings were irrelevant unless they interfered with results. I carried that lesson with me for years. At the time, I thought I was growing up. I didn't realize I was learning how to disappear. After that first moment, nothing dramatic changed. That was the dangerous part. Life went on, smooth on the surface, productive in every measurable way. And because there was no crisis, no obvious breaking point, I learned to treat that dismissal as normal. That's how patterns form, not through one loud event, but through repetition that slowly lowers your expectations of care. By the time I was 16, I no longer expected emotional conversations at home. I still lived there, still shared meals, still followed routines. But I had adjusted my internal settings. I brought home grades, not feelings, updates, not questions, results, not needs. My parents praised me often, but the praise was always conditional. You're so disciplined. You handle pressure well. We never have to worry about you. Those comments were meant as compliments. I accepted them like medals, but over time, they became instructions. They told me who I was allowed to be. Whenever I felt myself slipping, emotionally, mentally, I worked harder. I added structure. I revised more. I stayed up later. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it out of fear. I told myself I was being responsible. When I did try to speak up, the responses followed a familiar script. If I said I was stressed, my father would say, "That's life. You need to toughen up." If I said I felt overwhelmed, my mother would say, "Just focus on one thing at a time." If I hinted that something felt wrong, they would remind me how lucky I was. And in a way, I was lucky. That made everything more confusing. I had opportunities, support in practical forms, a stable home. There was food on the table, books on the shelves, and expectations for my future. Nothing about my situation fit the stereotype of a child in distress. So I learned to distrust my own reactions. I started telling myself, other people have it worse. I told myself, this is just how high achievers feel. I told myself, if I can still function, it can't be that bad. That's how dismissal becomes internalized. You start doing the work for others. At school, counselors talked about stress management, but it felt abstract. Mental health was discussed in assemblies, not in kitchens. It was something you learned about academically, not something you were allowed to experience personally. I absorbed the theory and ignored the symptoms. I became very good at appearing fine. Inside, though, there was a constant low level tension, like a background hum I couldn't turn off. I worried about disappointing my parents more than I worried about my own well being. I feared failure, not because of its consequences, but because of what it would confirm, that I wasn't as strong as everyone thought. And strength, in my family, meant silence. The strange thing is, no one ever told me directly not to talk about my feelings. There was no explicit rule. The rule was implied, enforced through reactions, or the lack of them. When emotions were met with efficiency instead of empathy, you learned quickly what belonged and what didn't. So I normalized it. I told myself my parents were practical, that they showed love through preparation. Those emotions were indulgent. I defended them internally whenever doubt surfaced. It felt disloyal to question their methods when they had sacrificed so much. But the cost was showing up in subtle ways. I stopped recognizing when I was overwhelmed until it became physical. Headaches, tight shoulders, a constant fatigue that sleep didn't fix. I lost touch with what I actually wanted because I was so focused on what was expected. When people asked me how I was, I answered automatically, fine, even when I wasn't sure what fine meant anymore. By the time university applications came around, the pressure intensified. Decisions felt permanent. Stakes felt enormous. My parents were deeply involved in the process, researching rankings, comparing outcomes, projecting futures. They spoke about my life as if it were a strategic plan. I went along with it, not because I was passionate about those paths, but because compliance felt safer than resistance. Looking back, this was the period when disrespect stopped feeling like something external and started feeling like a personal standard. I didn't feel angry. I felt numb, detached, efficient. That numbness was praised as maturity. What no one realized was that I wasn't becoming resilient. I was becoming disconnected from my body, from my intuition, from the ability to recognize when something wasn't right. And once disrespect feels normal, it's hard to name it. Harder still to imagine that things could be different. At the time, I thought I was coping. I didn't yet understand that coping without acknowledgement is just another form of erasure. By the time I reached my final years of school, the role I played in my family was firmly established. I didn't question it because it felt less like a role and more like an identity. Something fixed, unquestionable, quietly reinforced over time. I was the reliable one, the child who didn't need reminders, the one who handled pressure without complaint, the one who could be trusted to sort herself out. My parents spoke about me with a particular kind of pride, the kind reserved for things that work smoothly in the background. Sophie's fine, they would say to relatives. She's always been independent. She knows what she's doing. Independence, in this context, didn't mean freedom. It meant low emotional maintenance. I began to notice the contrast when I watched how they responded to other people. If a cousin struggled academically, there was concern. If a friend's child acted out, there was a discussion. But with me, the assumption was always stability. I had proven I didn't require attention, so none was offered. And once that expectation is set, it becomes self reinforcing. If I tried to express doubt or fatigue, it felt like breaking character. My parents would look surprised, almost confused, as if I had momentarily stepped out of the script. This doesn't sound like you, my mother would say. You've always handled things so well. That sentence did more than reassure them. It corrected me. It reminded me of who I was supposed to be. So I leaned into the role. I became organized to the point of rigidity. I planned everything. I left nothing to chance. My calendar was full, my notes color coded, my goals clearly defined. From the outside, it looked impressive. Inside, it felt narrow. I didn't give myself permission to be uncertain. Uncertainty felt like failure. I didn't allow myself to rest without guilt. Rest felt like weakness. I learned to anticipate expectations before they were spoken, to meet them quietly, efficiently, without needing guidance. Being useful became a way to stay safe. What I didn't realize at the time was that usefulness is not the same as being seen. You can be valuable and still invisible. You can be admired and still unknown. In my family, I wasn't asked what I wanted. That question simply didn't come up. Decisions were framed as obvious, practical, and necessary. My job was to adapt. When I hesitated about certain choices, subjects, universities, long term paths, the response was always pragmatic. This makes sense. This will open doors. You don't want to limit yourself. Those statements weren't wrong, they were just incomplete. They left no room for preference, for emotion, for the possibility that success might look different for me than it did on paper. Over time, I stopped checking in with myself entirely. I learned to measure progress externally: grades, feedback, outcomes. If those were good, I assumed I was fine. If something felt wrong, I treated it like a temporary malfunction to be fixed. This is how a role becomes a cage, when it's rewarded often enough that you stop imagining an alternative. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. I wasn't miserable. That's important to say. I functioned, I achieved, I met expectations. And because of that, no one thought to ask if the cost was too high, including me. The role I was assigned came with a quiet rule: don't complicate things, don't make emotions inconvenient, don't need too much, don't disrupt the system. So I didn't. I smiled when praised, I nodded when advised, I stayed quiet when something didn't sit right. I became very good at occupying space without taking up attention. Looking back, this was the period when I lost access to my own voice. Not because it was taken from me, but because I had learned it wasn't welcome. And when you spend long enough being reliable, useful, and invisible, you forget that being human was ever an option. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic declaration of independence. In fact, if you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. That's how internal changes usually begin, quietly, without witnesses. I was 19, in my first year away from home. The university had given me what I thought I wanted: distance, autonomy, the chance to prove I could handle things on my own. On paper, I was doing well. I kept my grades high, I met deadlines, I stayed organized. But something inside me felt increasingly brittle. One evening, I was sitting alone in the library long after most students had left. The building was nearly empty, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I had been staring at the same paragraph for almost 20 minutes, reading and rereading it without absorbing a word. My chest felt tight, my hands were cold, my thoughts were racing, but none of them were coherent. I wasn't panicking in the way people imagine panic. I wasn't crying or shaking. I was frozen, overloaded, unable to move forward or stop. Eventually, I closed the book and just sat there. And for the first time, I didn't tell myself to push through it. That was the shift. It sounds small, insignificant even. But that moment marked the first time I didn't immediately override my own discomfort in the name of productivity. I didn't force myself to keep working. I didn't shame myself for wasting time. I simply noticed that something was wrong. I remember thinking very clearly, if I keep doing this, something is going to break. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. That thought didn't come with fear or urgency. It came with clarity, almost calm, like recognizing a pattern you can't unsee. Up until then, I had believed that endurance was the answer to everything. If I could just tolerate enough pressure, I would eventually reach a place where it felt worth it. Sitting in that library, I realized I had been chasing an endpoint that didn't exist. There was always going to be another benchmark, another expectation, another version of better. And I was tired. I didn't call my parents that night. I didn't talk to friends about it. I didn't even fully articulate it to myself. But something had changed in how I related to my own silence. Before, silence had been automatic, a reflex, a way to avoid inconvenience. Now, it has become a pause. I started noticing how often I dismissed my own signals, how quickly I translated discomfort into discipline, how rarely I asked myself what I actually needed. The realization wasn't angry, it wasn't resentful, it was observant. And once you start observing yourself instead of correcting yourself, everything feels different. Over the next few weeks, nothing outwardly changed. I still studied, I still performed, I still presented the same composed version of myself to the world. But internally, I had stopped equating suffering with virtue. That distinction mattered. I began paying attention to moments when my body resisted, when I felt exhausted, numb, or disconnected. Instead of immediately suppressing those signals, I acknowledged them. I didn't always act on them, but I noticed them. That alone was new. This wasn't a rebellion, it was curiosity. The shift wasn't about rejecting my parents' values outright. It was about questioning the assumption that emotional cost was irrelevant, that mental strain was just collateral damage, that success justified everything it consumed. Sitting alone in that library, I understood something fundamental. No one was going to intervene on my behalf. There would be no external permission to slow down, to recalibrate, to choose differently. If anything was going to change, it would have to start internally, quietly, without announcement. And that's what made it powerful. From that day on, silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose, a space where I could think, observe, and decide without immediately performing for someone else's expectations. I didn't know yet where that would lead. I only knew that I couldn't go back to unthinking endurance. The shift wasn't visible, but it was irreversible. After that night in the library, my silence changed its shape. Before, it had been instinctive, an automatic response to pressure. I stayed quiet because it was easier, because it avoided friction, because it fit the role I had been trained to play. Now, silence became intentional, deliberate, almost strategic. Outwardly, nothing looked different. That was the point. I still answered messages promptly. I still sent my parents updates about my grades. I still sounded calm on phone calls. If anything, I appeared even more composed than before. But internally, I had stopped offering explanations that would be dismissed. I stopped volunteering emotional information to people who had never shown interest in holding it. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I realized that every time I tried to explain my mental state to my parents, the conversation followed the same arc: minimize, normalize, redirect to performance. They weren't malicious, they were consistent. And consistency, over time, teaches you where not to knock. So I stopped knocking. When my mother asked, "How's university going?" I said, "Fine, busy, but fine." That answer was true in the narrowest sense, and it required no correction, no advice, no emotional labor. It was efficient. It protected my energy. They mistook this for strength. See, my father said once, you're handling it. I didn't correct him. There was no benefit in doing so. Silence, I learned, could be a boundary without requiring explanation. At the same time, something else was happening quietly in the background. Without announcing it to anyone, I started building an internal record. I paid attention to patterns, what conversations drained me, what assumptions were repeatedly made about me, how often my needs were reframed as inconveniences. I wasn't collecting evidence to confront anyone. I wasn't planning a dramatic reveal. I was simply observing the way you observe a system once you realize it isn't designed for you. An observation creates distance. I noticed how my parents only asked about outcomes, never processes. How their pride is activated around achievements, not around well being. How they spoke about my future as a series of milestones, not experiences. None of this was new, but now, instead of internalizing it, I noted it. That distinction mattered. People often assume silence means weakness. That if you don't protest, you agree. That if you don't complain, you're unaffected. My parents made that assumption too. They believed my quietness meant alignment, acceptance, resilience. What they didn't see was that my silence was no longer about approval. It was about conserving autonomy. I began making small decisions without consulting them. Not rebellious ones, practical ones. Choices about my schedule, my workload, my priorities. I stopped framing my life as something that needed to be justified. There was a subtle shift in how I listened during phone calls. I stopped absorbing their expectations as instructions. I heard them as opinions, background noise, information, not commands. This didn't make me colder. If anything, it made me calmer. When you stop trying to be understood by people who aren't listening, you free up an enormous amount of mental space. That space allowed me to think long term for the first time, not in terms of achievement, but in terms of sustainability. I started asking myself different questions. Not, how do I meet expectations? But what kind of life can I actually maintain? Not what looks impressive, but what doesn't hollow me out. These questions stayed private. I didn't share them with my parents. I didn't debate them with friends. I let them sit, unanswered, slowly reshaping how I saw my own future. Silence became a container, a place where I could recalibrate without interference. To everyone else, I was the same Sophie, disciplined, calm, dependable. But internally, I was no longer negotiating my worth. I was no longer asking for permission to take myself seriously. They thought my quiet meant compliance. In reality, it meant withdrawal from a system that had never made room for my inner life. And once silence becomes a choice instead of a reflex, it stops being passive. It becomes preparation. What my parents never noticed was not a single action or decision. It was a process. Because from the outside, I still looked exactly the same. I still spoke to them regularly. I still shared surface level updates. I still sounded composed, rational, grounded. I didn't withdraw dramatically or announce boundaries. I didn't change my tone. I didn't challenge their assumptions. That familiarity worked in my favor. What they didn't see was that I had stopped living reactively. I had begun preparing, quietly, methodically, without emotional urgency. It started with attention. I paid attention to how conversations unfolded and where they always ended. I noticed how often my parents framed support as pressure and how rarely they asked open ended questions. I noticed that whenever I hinted at exhaustion, the response was always a solution, never a pause. Advice, not understanding. So I stopped offering hints. Instead, I turned that attention inward. I began tracking my own limits the way I had once tracked grades. I noticed how long I could sustain certain rhythms before feeling depleted. Which environments drained me? Which expectations felt imposed rather than chosen? This wasn't self pity, it was data collection. I also began learning about stress, burnout, emotional neglect, and the long term effects of conditional approval. Not obsessively, not dramatically, quietly. In the same disciplined way I had always approached academics. The difference was the goal. Before, learning had been about performance. Now, it was about self preservation. I didn't label my parents as villains. I didn't rewrite my childhood in extremes. I simply acknowledged a truth I had avoided for years. Their way of loving me had left gaps. And those gaps had shaped me in ways I needed to understand if I was ever going to change direction. I also started documenting my own patterns. When I felt anxious, I didn't suppress it immediately. I noted it. When I felt numb, I asked what preceded it. When I felt relief, I paid attention to why. This kind of internal work is invisible by design. There's no announcement, no external validation. And because I had always been praised for functioning, no one noticed that I was redefining what functioning meant. My parents assumed I was simply maturing. In a way, they were right. I stopped seeking reassurance from them. I stopped measuring my choices by their reactions. I began building a version of my life that didn't rely on their approval to feel legitimate. That included practical preparation. I became financially literate. I learned how to budget independently, how to plan without family input, and how to assess risk without deferring to authority. I made sure I understood my options, not just academically, but structurally. Independence, I realized, wasn't emotional distance, it was logistical clarity. At the same time, I was careful not to provoke concern. I didn't want questions. Questions invited opinions. Opinions invited pressure. Silence kept things neutral. They never noticed that I had stopped asking for advice. They never noticed that I had stopped updating them on decisions until after they were made. They never noticed that I had stopped hoping they would finally ask the right question, because hope had been replaced by something steadier. Acceptance, not the passive kind. The clear-eyed kind that recognizes limitations without resentment. I accepted that my parents were unlikely to change, that their worldview was deeply embedded, that waiting for validation I might never receive was costing me energy I could no longer afford to waste. And once you accept that, preparation becomes possible. I wasn't preparing to confront them. I wasn't preparing to cut them off. I was preparing to live in a way that didn't require constant self erasure. That meant building support elsewhere, quietly forming connections with people who asked how I was and waited for the answer, allowing myself to rest without justifying it, redefining success in terms of sustainability rather than impressiveness. None of this was visible in family photos or phone calls. To my parents, I was still the same dependable daughter, still doing well, still handling it. What they never noticed was that I had stopped orienting my life around being handled. I was building something else, internally, structurally, patiently. And by the time they would sense a shift, it wouldn't be something they could talk me out of. Because preparation doesn't announce itself, it just accumulates. The reveal didn't arrive as a sudden realization. There was no dramatic moment where everything clicked into place. It unfolded slowly, through an accumulation, like understanding of something you've been circling for years. Finally, from the right angle. I was in my early 20s by then, living independently, functioning well by any external standard. I had structure, direction, a path that made sense on paper. And yet, something inside me remained oddly distant from it all. One afternoon, I found myself filling out a routine form. Nothing important, just administrative details. There was a section that asked about emergency contacts. I stared at it longer than necessary, not because I didn't know who to write down, but because I realized, with unexpected clarity, that the people listed there were not the people I would call if I were emotionally overwhelmed. They were the people I would contact for logistics, for solutions, for efficiency, not for care. That was the moment I finally named it. My parents had prepared me for success, but not for distress. They had taught me how to function, but not how to feel safe when I wasn't functioning. And I had internalized that lesson so thoroughly that even in private, I didn't fully trust my own vulnerability. That recognition wasn't accompanied by anger. It was almost clinical, like diagnosing an old injury you had learned to compensate for. I saw clearly how academic pressure had shaped my internal hierarchy, performance at the top, emotions at the bottom. How my mental health had been treated as secondary, manageable only insofar as it didn't interfere with results, and how I had absorbed that value system without question. This wasn't about blame anymore, it was about leverage. The leverage was understanding. Once I understood the dynamic, I stopped personalizing it. I no longer interpreted my parents' responses as reflections of my worth. I saw them as reflections of their limits, their fears, their own conditioning. And that shifted everything. I realized that I didn't need their acknowledgement to validate what I had experienced. I didn't need them to agree with me in order for my reality to be legitimate. Waiting for that recognition had kept me emotionally stalled. The private reveal was this: I could step out of the system without dismantling it. I didn't have to confront. I didn't have to explain myself in a way they would never fully understand. I didn't have to win an argument that required emotional tools they didn't have. I could simply choose differently. That clarity was grounding. It removed urgency. There was no rush to act, no need to declare independence loudly. The power was in the quiet certainty that I no longer needed their framework to make decisions about my life. I also saw the cost of continuing as I was. The slow erosion of self-trust, the way I minimized my own needs automatically, the exhaustion that came not from workload, but from constant self-monitoring. Once you see that cost clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore. I didn't celebrate this realization. There was no sense of triumph. If anything, there was grief. For the years I had spent believing that being well adjusted meant being emotionally invisible. For the child who had learned too early that distress was inconvenient. But grief didn't paralyze me. It clarified my priorities. I began asking myself one quiet question over and over. What would change if my mental health were not negotiable? not something to be managed later, not a reward for success, but a baseline requirement. The answers didn't come all at once, but they came steadily. And with each answer, I felt more solid, less reactive, less compelled to justify my choices. The need for approval faded, not because I had rejected my parents, but because I had outgrown the role they needed me to play. They never knew about this shift. They never saw the moment when their influence quietly loosened its grip. To them, nothing had changed. To me, everything had. Because once you privately reclaim your internal authority, external dynamics lose their power without a single confrontation. And that kind of clarity doesn't announce itself. It simply settles in. The decision didn't arrive as a single choice. It arrived as a narrowing. Once the private reveal had settled in, I began to see my options more clearly. Not as possibilities, but as paths with consequences I could finally evaluate honestly. For the first time, I wasn't asking which path looked best or which one would earn the most approval. I was asking which one I could live inside without constantly overriding myself. There were several options in front of me. I could continue as I was, high functioning, outwardly successful, emotionally contained. That path was familiar, predictable. It required no explanations and very little resistance. My parents would remain comfortable. Conversations would stay smooth. I would continue to be praised for coping. But I knew the cost now. I had felt it accumulating for years. Staying meant accepting that my mental health would always be secondary, something I tended to quietly rather than protected deliberately. Another option was confrontation. I could sit my parents down and explain everything: the pressure, the anxiety, the years of emotional minimization. I could ask them to understand something they had never been equipped to see. I could hope for validation, for remorse, for a different kind of relationship. But hope, I had learned, was expensive. That option required emotional labor from me, with no guarantee of return. It also required them to change in ways they had never shown interest in changing. I knew what those conversations would sound like: well meaning, defensive, practical. Solutions were offered where acknowledgement was needed, explanations where empathy should have been. I didn't want to spend my energy proving my pain was real. The third option was quieter, but more definitive. I could restructure my life in a way that no longer depended on their expectations. Not by cutting them off, not by rebelling, but by removing their influence from my decision making process entirely. I could stop orienting my choices around how they would react. This option didn't require permission, it required resolve. Choosing it meant accepting a certain kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of standing on your own internal authority. It meant giving up the hope that they would one day suddenly understand. It meant letting go of the role I had been rewarded for playing. That was the irreversible part. Once you stop seeking validation from people who shaped you, you can't unsee how much of your life was built around earning it. I took time with this decision. I didn't rush it. I let myself imagine each path honestly. How would it feel in 5 years? In 10? Whether it would allow me to breathe. And slowly, the answer became obvious. Not emotionally charged, not dramatic, just clear. I chose the path that protected my internal stability, even if it confused others. That meant making decisions privately and sharing them after the fact. It meant setting limits without announcing them. It meant redefining success, in ways my parents wouldn't necessarily recognize or celebrate. I didn't tell them I had chosen differently. I just did. I adjusted my plans. I selected opportunities based on sustainability rather than prestige. I prioritized environments that didn't reward constant self sacrifice. I built a life that could hold me on difficult days, not just impressive ones. To my parents, it looked like I was still doing well, just in a slightly different direction. They didn't object, they didn't question it deeply. They assumed, as they always had, that I knew what I was doing. And this time, they were right, but not for the reasons they thought. The decision point wasn't about rejecting them, it was about choosing myself without asking for approval. It was about recognizing that waiting to be understood had become a form of self abandonment. Once I made that choice, there was no turning back, not because of conflict, but because of alignment. My actions finally matched what I knew to be true. The quietest decisions are often the most permanent. And this one reshaped everything that followed. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to explain it to anyone. That surprised me. I'd spent so much of my life translating myself, justifying choices, preempting disappointment, managing reactions, that I assumed this phase would require even more explanation. Instead, it required less. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy, it was about containment. I began to make changes that were practical, incremental, and almost invisible. I adjusted my routines first. I stopped overloading my schedule simply to prove endurance. I allowed gaps, unproductive by my old standards, restorative by my new ones. I chose work that demanded focus but not constant urgency. I paid attention to how my body responded to different environments and took that feedback seriously. None of this was announced. When my parents asked what I was doing next, I gave them answers that were accurate but incomplete. Not evasive, just sufficient. I'm working in a role that suits me. I'm exploring a few options. I'm stable. Stability was a language they understood. Behind that calm exterior, I was restructuring my life with intention. I reviewed my finances carefully, ensuring I didn't rely on emotional support disguised as practical help. I created buffers, time, savings, flexibility, so that stress didn't immediately escalate into crisis. I built a life that didn't collapse the moment I slowed down. That was new. Before, slowing down felt dangerous, like stepping off a moving train. Now, I was designing the train to move at a pace I could actually sustain. I also became selective about what I shared emotionally and with whom. I stopped trying to be easy in every relationship. I let myself be quiet when I needed to be, and expressive when it felt safe. I learned that not everyone was entitled to my inner world, and that withholding it wasn't deception, it was discernment. My parents didn't notice these shifts because they weren't looking for them. They measured success through visible markers, and I still met enough of those to remain unremarkable. In their eyes, I was still responsible, still progressing, still on track. That misinterpretation worked in my favor. There's a kind of power in being underestimated. Not because you want to surprise anyone, but because it gives you room to move without interference. While they assumed continuity, I was creating distance. Not physical distance, but psychological independence. I stopped seeking their approval in small ways first. I didn't mentally rehearse conversations before calling. I didn't brace myself for judgment. I stopped adjusting my tone to sound more convincing. I spoke plainly. If they offered advice I didn't need, I acknowledged it and moved on. I no longer felt compelled to follow it or argue against it. Advice became background noise instead of direction. That shift was subtle but profound. I noticed that my anxiety decreased, not because life became easier, but because I was no longer negotiating my worth internally. Decisions felt lighter when they weren't auditions. Mistakes felt survivable when they weren't moral failures. This was what moving in silence really meant, acting from alignment rather than reaction. There was no announcement phase, no moment where I stood up to anyone, no declaration of boundaries. The boundaries existed because my behavior changed, not because I named them. And because there was no conflict, no resistance, no visible rupture, my parents assumed nothing significant had shifted. They didn't realize that the version of me who needed their validation had quietly stepped aside. By the time consequences would begin to surface, the groundwork was already laid. Because when you move in silence long enough, what changes isn't just your circumstances, it's your center of gravity. The consequences didn't arrive as conflict, they arrived as an absence. At first, it was subtle enough to be dismissed. A missed update here, a delayed response there. Nothing that could be pointed to directly. Nothing dramatic enough to justify concern. Just a gradual thinning of my emotional availability. I hadn't planned it that way. It was a natural result of no longer orienting my life around my parents' expectations. When conversations stayed surface level, I let them stay there. When calls became routine check ins rather than genuine connections, I didn't try to deepen them. I stopped filling silences. I stopped compensating for the lack of curiosity with extra explanation. And slowly, they began to feel it. My parents were used to a certain version of access to me, not intrusive, but assumed. They expected availability, updates, responsiveness, emotional steadiness. When that access changed, even slightly, it created a sense of loss they couldn't quite name. They started asking different questions. You seem busy lately. Everything okay? You don't talk as much as you used to. The questions were gentle but confused. They weren't rooted in concern for my inner world. They were responses to a disruption in a familiar pattern. I answered honestly, but briefly. I'm fine. Just focused on a few things. Nothing to worry about. And those answers were true. What they were really noticing was that I no longer offered emotional surplus. I wasn't managing their comfort by staying predictably accessible. I wasn't adjusting my energy to reassure them. This wasn't punishment, it was in equilibrium. Over time, the dynamic shifted further. They reached out more often, not with criticism, but with an unfamiliar uncertainty. Conversations lingered awkwardly, topics repeated. There was a sense that something had changed, but no clear language for it. From their perspective, I had always been the stable constant, the one who didn't require attention, the one who handled things quietly. Now, that quiet felt different, less accommodating, less transparent. They didn't know why, and because there was no event to blame, no argument to resolve, the discomfort had nowhere to go. I noticed it, of course, but I didn't rush to fix it. In the past, I would have filled that gap instinctively, reassuring them, offering explanations, smoothing over unease. Now I let the discomfort exist, not out of cruelty, but out of respect for my own limits. For the first time, I wasn't absorbing emotional responsibility that didn't belong to me. This was the consequence of moving in silence. When you stop performing availability, people feel the absence of something they assumed would always be there. My parents began to reminisce more, referencing my younger years, my achievements, the version of me that fit neatly into their narrative. It felt like an unconscious attempt to anchor me to a familiar role. I listened. I didn't correct them. What they didn't understand was that the version of me they missed wasn't gone out of rebellion. She had simply outgrown the environment that required her to stay small emotionally. And that kind of change doesn't reverse itself to ease someone else's discomfort. There was no confrontation to point to, no apology to request, no mistake to undo. Just a growing awareness that something essential had shifted and that it wasn't coming back in its old form. The consequences weren't dramatic, they were quiet, and because of that, they were harder to escape. By the time my parents realized something was truly wrong, they couldn't trace it back to a single moment. That's what made it unsettling for them. There had been no argument, no refusal, no slam doors or harsh words. From their perspective, I hadn't done anything wrong. I was still polite, still responsive, still functional. And yet, the connection they assumed was permanent now felt distant, muted in a way they didn't know how to address. They started trying to fix it, not directly, not emotionally, in the ways they knew how. They offered advice more often, asked about my plans with renewed intensity, suggested alternatives, opportunities, improvements. It was familiar territory for them, problem solving instead of listening. But this time, it didn't land. Their suggestions no longer carried weight because they were offered too late, after I had already rebuilt my internal framework, after I had stopped relying on them as emotional anchors, after I had accepted that their version of support came with conditions I was no longer willing to meet. They could sense the shift, but they misdiagnosed the cause. My mother once asked carefully, "Did we do something wrong?" The question surprised me, not because it was insightful, but because it came so late. It wasn't followed by curiosity or space. It was followed by a nervous explanation. "We just want what's best for you. We pushed you because we believed in you. You know we're proud of you." I nodded. I didn't argue. Those statements had always been true. They just weren't complete. What they were offering now was reassurance, not repair. And reassurance doesn't reach wounds that were never acknowledged in the first place. I could feel their anxiety rising, the sense that something important was slipping away, and they didn't know how to grab it back. They asked more questions, but still the wrong ones. They focused on outcomes, on plans, on visible markers of stability. They didn't ask how I was feeling. Even now, that was when I knew it was too late to fix it the way they wanted to. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the conversation they were reaching for required emotional tools they didn't have and hadn't developed when it mattered most. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. I realized that even if I explained everything perfectly, even if I laid out years of pressure and silence with precision, it wouldn't create the connection they were hoping for. It would only create defensiveness, guilt, or intellectual agreement without emotional understanding. And I didn't want any of that. I had spent too long managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own. I wasn't willing to do it again just to restore a familiar dynamic. So I stayed calm, kind, reserved. I answered what they asked, not what they hoped for. I didn't reopen old ground. I didn't seek apologies. I didn't offer absolution. I let the distance remain, not as punishment, but as a boundary that had formed naturally and solidly. That boundary wasn't something I had built consciously. It was the result of years of self protection finally taking shape. My parents were confused by it. They felt regret, but without direction, concern, but without access. They wanted to go back, not to a specific moment, but to a version of me that felt reachable. What they didn't understand was that the version of me who needed to be reached no longer existed. You can't retroactively provide emotional safety. You can't undo years of conditional approval with a sudden surge of concern. And you can't rush intimacy once someone has learned to survive without it. That doesn't make anyone a villain. It just makes timing matter. By the time my parents were ready to listen, I no longer needed to be heard by them. I had already done the listening, quietly, internally, over many years. And that was the moment I understood something painful but freeing. Not everything broken requires confrontation. Some things simply reach a point where they can no longer be repaired in the way one side expects. And accepting that is its own kind of closure. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not what people imagine when they hear that word. There was no explosion, no raised voices, no list of accusations delivered after years of silence. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary room, with tea growing cold between us. That alone told me how much I had changed. My parents were tense in a way I hadn't seen before. Not defensive, but uncertain. As if they were standing on unfamiliar ground. My mother spoke first, carefully, choosing each word. "We feel like you're farther away," she said, "and we don't know why." I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't soften the moment. I let the silence exist long enough to be honest. "I am," I said calmly, "but not in the way you think." They looked at me, waiting, not interrupting. That was new. I didn't start from childhood. I didn't catalog moments. I didn't explain myself like a case to be proven. I spoke in present terms because that was all that mattered now. "I've built my life in a way that protects my mental health," I said. "And that means I don't operate under the same pressures I used to." My father frowned slightly. "We only ever wanted you to succeed." "I know," I said. And I meant it. But success without emotional safety has a cost. I paid it quietly for a long time. There was no accusation in my voice, no bitterness, just a fact. They tried to respond with logic, with intention, with sacrifice, with pride. I didn't argue against any of it. I let their words land where they belonged, as explanations, not justifications. "I'm not asking you to change," I said, "and I'm not blaming you. I'm just explaining why things are different now." That was the boundary. They waited for more. An invitation to fix it, to repair it, to step back into authority. It didn't come. What I offered instead was clarity. "I won't measure my worth through pressure anymore," I said. "And I won't negotiate my mental health for approval. That doesn't mean I don't care about you. It just means I live differently now." The room was quiet, not tense, not hostile, just still. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood at any cost. I was simply stating what was true and letting them take it or leave it. My mother nodded slowly. She didn't fully understand. That much was clear. But she understood enough to realize this wasn't a phase or rebellion or something to be corrected. It was final. There was no apology, no dramatic reconciliation, and strangely, I didn't need one. Because the purpose of that conversation wasn't emotional release, it was alignment. I left that afternoon feeling lighter, not because everything had been resolved, but because nothing had been distorted. I hadn't minimized myself. I hadn't over explained. I hadn't taken responsibility for emotions that weren't mine to manage. Confrontation without heat isn't about winning, it's about standing firmly in your own reality without trying to pull someone else into it by force. That day, I realized something quietly powerful. When you speak from clarity instead of pain, the conversation doesn't escalate, it settles. And whether the other person follows you there or not, you remain standing. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was before. That's important. I didn't become reckless or disengaged. I didn't reject structure or ambition. I didn't swing from pressure into chaos. What changed wasn't my capacity, it was my orientation. I no longer live to prove that I can handle everything. For most of my life, competence was my shield. It protected me from scrutiny, from disappointment, from having to articulate needs I wasn't sure would be met. Now, competence is simply a tool, not an identity. I still work hard. I still care about doing things well. But I don't equate exhaustion with virtue anymore. I don't assume that struggle is the price of worthiness. I notice my limits and treat them as information, not obstacles to be overridden. That shift has changed how I move through the world. I choose environments that value steadiness over intensity. I build routines that include rest without apology. I allow myself to be quiet without feeling invisible and to speak without feeling like I'm asking for too much. My relationship with my parents exists now in a different register. It's respectful, calm, and contained. I don't expect emotional depth where there has never been much. I don't offer more of myself than I'm willing to give. And that makes our interactions cleaner, less charged, less disappointing. Some people might call that distance. I call it accuracy. I no longer look to my parents to validate my choices or reflect my emotional reality. That role has been released, not with resentment, but with realism. They gave me what they knew how to give. I stopped asking them for what they didn't know how to offer. That alone has brought a surprising amount of peace. I'm also more attuned to others now, not in a self sacrificing way, but in a grounded one. Because I've learned what it feels like to be praised but unseen. I pay attention to the quiet people. I ask follow up questions. I notice when someone is performing stability instead of living it. And I don't mistake silence for strength anymore, especially in myself. If there's a form of dominance in this story, it's not control over others, it's self possession. The ability to choose without defending, to be calm without being compliant, to be firm without being loud. I don't need to prove what I've overcome. I don't need to display resilience as a badge. My life speaks for itself in small, consistent ways. I sleep better now. That might sound insignificant, but it isn't. Sleep used to be where my thoughts ambushed me, where pressure replayed itself in loops I couldn't interrupt. Now, rest feels safe. My body trusts that it doesn't have to stay alert all the time. That trust was hard earned. Who I am now is someone who understands that achievement without emotional care is fragile. That pressure without attunement creates compliance, not confidence. That mental health isn't something you earn by being good enough. It's something you protect because you're human. I didn't arrive here through rebellion or validation or dramatic transformation. I arrived here by listening to myself after years of being very good at not doing that. And I intend to stay. If there's a moral to this story, it isn't that academic pressure is always wrong or that parents who push their children don't care. Most pressure comes from fear of instability, of missed opportunities, of a world that feels unforgiving. My parents were trying to prepare me for that world. What they didn't realize is that preparation without emotional safety teaches a different lesson. That your value is conditional, that rest must be earned, that distress is an inconvenience rather than a signal. The cost of that lesson doesn't always show up immediately. It shows up later, in adults who function well but feel disconnected, in people who are praised for coping while quietly burning out, in those who don't know how to ask for help without feeling like they're failing. For a long time, I thought resilience meant silence, that strength meant not needing anything. If I could just handle enough pressure, I would eventually feel secure. I was wrong. Real resilience came when I stopped negotiating my mental health. When I accepted that being high achieving didn't exempt me from needing care. When I understood that no amount of success could compensate for a life lived in constant self erasure. This story isn't about cutting people off or proving anyone wrong. It's about recognizing when a system, even a well intentioned one, is costing you more than it gives, and having the quiet courage to step out of it without needing permission. Some parents will never fully understand the emotional impact of the pressure they applied. Some conversations will always arrive too late. That doesn't mean you're obligated to keep paying the price. You're allowed to redefine success. You're allowed to protect your inner life. You're allowed to choose sustainability over approval. And you don't have to make that choice loudly. If you grew up feeling like your achievements mattered more than your mental health, if you learned early how to perform stability while struggling in private, if you're only now questioning the cost of being the reliable one, you're not alone. The quietest shifts often lead to the most lasting change. So I'll end with this question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. When did you first realize that doing well on the outside didn't mean you were actually okay on the inside?